You may not be interested in cognitive warfare, but cognitive warfare is interested in you. And I think really getting people to understand how much they are in play.
Woo, welcome. You have now entered Mad Warfare, mutually assured distraction, where we explore the weird, terrifying, and sometimes hilarious ways war is fought today, and how we can all protect our minds before we go too mad to find them.
Oh my!
Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern.
How can you talk if you haven't got a brain?
Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern. Dangerous pattern.
Can a fictional story start a real war or teach us how to end one before it begins? That's what we're exploring today on Mad Warfare. Welcome back. I'm Jocelyn Brady.
I'm Sean Guillory.
Our guest today has spent his career turning fiction into foresight, like a genie. He's the co-author of Ghost Fleet and Burn In, a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, and co-founder of Useful Fiction, a consultancy that helps governments and militaries imagine and prepare for the future. Please welcome August Cole.
Great to be here. I'm really excited to get a chance to talk about one of my favorite things, cognitive warfare and this kind of new frontier. So let's have at it.
We love people who say that cognitive warfare is one of my favorite things.
These are a few.
These are a few of our
Same time.
favorite.
Again, single brain cell at this point. Again, 20 episodes in.
Yeah. August, you went from reporting for the Wall Street Journal to co-writing techno thrillers that influenced generals. Was this a long con to smuggle fan fiction into the Pentagon?
It's funny, you spend enough time working in the nonfiction realm, the fact-based realm, the nuts and bolts of, say, journalism or the policy world, and you start to realize that there might be a better way to get people's attention and hold it, and more importantly, to get them to think about the things they don't want to think about.
What was that switch like to go, okay, I've been in this world, now I want to use fiction to have a perhaps similar or more powerful influence?
It was less of an abrupt shift than you might think. And maybe that's just the approach that made the most sense to me because of that journalistic and nonfiction background. But in my mind, being totally squared away on your research, not just the technical aspects of, I don't know, a weapon system or something like that, but really trying to understand the human side of it, core to a really good narrative, whether it's, again, nonfiction journalism or whether it's a novel. And so there was a lot of synergy there. I mean, I think one of the risks that any novelist has, particularly when you get into the techno-thriller realm, it's like over-researching. Mm-hmm. You know, you can just go down rabbit holes, and boy, does the internet enable us to do that, which is probably a topic we'll tackle a little later. And I think that the credibility that fiction can have, particularly in the national security realm, comes from hewing to those rules of the real. It's sort of this idea that Peter and I have in which the future is going to have a lot of unfamiliar and extraordinary and surprising, both good and bad aspects to it. But there's going to be a lot of things that we'll recognize pretty easily. Things like Murphy's Law will exist in the future. There'll be bureaucracy. But also understanding that when you're describing a world that doesn't exist, being able to create it in a way that feels relatable, that feels like it's a world that the reader could actually be living in themselves. And sometimes I feel like authors can miss that mark. And you can get so in love with like the world you're building and forget to like put people in it. And so from my perspective, being able to kind of bridge this nonfiction and fiction realm, take it into kind of the consequential conversations about the rise of China or our domestic future around AI and robotics and social, political, and economic disruption, whether we're looking at emerging ways of warfare, right? Are we at war right now? These are really difficult questions to answer in discrete ways. And I would say also that the more people we have in that conversation, the better chance we have to getting some alignment about what to do about any one of those.
It really did almost hide the medicine in the cupcake in terms of really beginning to get folks to think about things around narrative in the national security space. Like that being a goal to almost Trojan horse folks thinking more about narrative. I was just wondering if you and Peter were thinking about that when you were coming up with Ghost Fleet.
I would say it was less of a deception operation and more of a call to action. You know, the experience we had, and both Peter and I literally had the same experience well before we ever met each other. When Red Storm Rising came out in 1986, both he and I read it. I think it was a summer book, and immediately. And we're were engrossed. And the things that I think Red Storm Rising did that were really unique, it basically thought the unthinkable, Tom Clancy, this author, did, and then tried to look at the globality of what a third world war might look like with, in his mind, the most kind of accurate depiction of the real world doctrine impacts. How is warfighting going to be happening in Europe, in the North Atlantic, et cetera? Space even was something he touched on. And having had that experience and known the impact, and of course, that's a different era in terms of the power of the novel. That was changing in 2015 and certainly changing in 2025. But being able to really tap into that was a book that Reagan had Margaret Thatcher read, right, before they had the Reykjavik summit. To me, that was our goal, right, was to create something that was entertaining and relevant, but also could potentially change the way people thought. And from the perspective of a couple nonfiction guys like Peter and I, it was a bit risky to turn to fiction because we certainly were well-versed and soaked in the nonfiction and wonky realms of DC. But again, having had this kind of gut instinct that it would be fun, first of all, right? You don't undertake a book project without hopefully taking some joy in it, in the writing and the collaboration, in our case, and in the research, that we would have this novel basically reframe how people thought about China's rise. Because at the time, it felt like one of those underappreciated threats, one of those underappreciated shifts in the kind of global strategic environment. People were constantly pegging the PLA as being a fairly unsophisticated military that was a land army that really didn't have ambitions beyond that. And then you would look, though, at some of the technical writing and the aviation trade press. You'd look at their own doctrine, which was actually pretty sophisticated and foretold, I think, a lot of what we've seen over the last decade. And so for us, and this is a bit like where I find the demand signals, I always try to think about what are the corners of the room where there's no light shining into them, or what are the bigger truths that nobody wants to talk about. And so Ghost Fleet was part of that. The Atlantic Council at that time, too, not long after, I started working on the Art of Future Warfare project, which was the first, in many ways, experiment from my experience to try to regularize or at least introduce us into official Washington. And we had a lot of success there. And to the Atlantic Council's credit, Barry Pavel and Steve Grunman funding that with internal funding, which in think tanks rarely ever happens for this kind of stuff, but they both really believed in it. We did some remarkable work connecting with Hollywood, connecting with real world policymakers. And so things started to shift, but I will say when Ghost Fleet came out, we were really unsure whether people would laugh at it or whether they would take it seriously. And because you just don't know, right? This is a subjective thing. Is a book good or not? And by showing our homework, and this kind of gets back to what you were saying, by including people a bit in our process through the almost 30 pages of endnotes, we allowed folks to understand that this was a different approach. Not only were we going to talk about new domains like cyber and space at the time, but we were going to kind of cite the think tank reports, cite the PLA doctrine, cite the news articles that you could stitch together and get a sense that, all right, things are actually different. And of course, the Pentagon at the time was focused on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, and that was the order of the day. But yet China was taking that opportunity to grow its military capability, to become more ambitious, to kind of seize that focus that we had elsewhere. And we're living in that world a decade later.
With that, which actually, before I get to this other question, let me give a shout out in terms of, again, like your other big books in terms of Burn In, because next question I'm going to ask in terms of if there's anything that you feel like you either may have missed or got incorrect with Ghost Fleet. But the thing about Burn In that's like terrifying, it came afterwards, but it's terrifying how accurate, like right now. So you're seeing again, like the things like right now that you're mentioning in Burn In. So I don't even want to ask about that one because one is again like a later book, but it seems like the things are again almost like manifesting quicker on that one. But I was curious in terms of Ghost Fleet, if you felt like there was anything that you thought you either missed in terms of occluded or missed in terms of you just felt like you got wrong in terms of with Ghost Fleet as we look 10 years later.
Every writer is their own worst critic or best critic. Is that the way to say it? And I think there's an issue when you have a big world encompassing story is that you only get so many pages. When we turned in our initial first draft, it was, I think, almost like 80 or 100 pages longer than what we submitted. And publishers' eyebrows went up and he just was like, wait, what? And we're like, yeah, this is like the same length as Red Storm Rising. And he's like, yeah, but you're not Tom Clancy. So we had to make some really hard choices. There's that adage, kill your darlings in editing, and we had to kill a lot of darlings in storylines. There were storylines about what it would be like to be the president, what the domestic political and information environment was going to be like, some more about the defense industrial base and the response on the part of contractors and stuff. And I think the book is probably leaner and stronger without some of that. But given the importance now of this kind of very strategic information space and the fight that's ongoing right now, I would love to have had more of that in there. And we did it in small ways. And it's funny when you write a long novel, what people pick up on is not often what you really intended to plant a flag in. For example, there's a throwaway line about describing some of the instability in the Indo-Pacific that China is taking advantage of, including what we call the former Republic of Indonesia. This caused a major political scandal, a brouhaha, in Indonesia for like over a year, because the book was raised as a forecast that foretold their collapse. And that was a line for us that was about world building, not about trying to make a statement per se. And so you have these aspects that are a bit out of your hands. Another one where we didn't get as much traction on, which I wish we had, which was the idea that you would see the rise of a isolationist movement, in part funded and stoked by the Chinese, to let them keep Hawaii, not to spoil the book. And a group of lawmakers and others called 49ers who were like, China can have it. We can be fine with 49 states. We don't need our 50th. And that was a really, I think, interesting thread to pull, but it wasn't really core to the kind of larger, almost orthopedic movements of the story. We did do some really cool propaganda art, though, that we imagined would be in like Honolulu, like talking about this 49er movement. And that's actually one of the favorite things that we did that wasn't part of the book in terms of getting people's attention around that.
Oh, wow. Can't get rid of the best state. That's where I was raised. Another 50th state. There's a couple
It's
things.
worth fighting for. I hope they're listening.
God. A couple things that this all brought to mind. One is I have a dear friend, a writer, and she says technical writing explains how something works. Copywriting, which is what she does, explains why I should care. And hearing you talk, it makes me think fiction helps you to think, what am I going to do about something that's going to happen? How do I prepare? And to Sean's kind of touched on this, but when you're writing these or when you published something, how often do things materialize that you've written? And excuse my kind of woo statement coming up, do you ever fear that by writing things down, there's a greater chance of them happening?
Oh, like self-fulfilling. I gotcha.
We're going to conjure our demise off the page. It's a really interesting question. And it has another dimension to it too, around like sensitive information or classification of information. And the way I'll answer it is, I think I would say that in our case, especially because we're citing and drawing upon information that's out there, then of course using our imagination to put it together into a scenario or a world, putting characters in the middle of it, we can confidently say the bad guys, so to speak, the adversary has thought of this already, because we're literally pointing to their doctrine, right? We're pointing to a news article that shows what a hacking group did with a certain air gap hopping, like that cyber tactic. And in many cases, and this goes back to my journalism life, there were often really big things that were exceptionally problematic in the defense realm that were known by a core community, experts who were trying to tackle that problem, but nobody else cared. Right. And often it was in the too hard box, that kind of thing. And so for me, being able to show an adversary having success like the PLA, and it's basically knocking out much of our space capability as a first move, that's something they were thinking about even then, of course, and I know they are now. So to me, I would rather draw attention to that so we can, to your point, do something about it. And one of the great examples of this comes from an area that isn't usually at the forefront of what people are really jazzed about in the DoD community, which is like supply chain security. So in Ghost Fleet, we were thinking, okay, how do we, if we're the adversary, how do we exploit that? How do we arbitrage this? And we're, again, seeing policy today over the last few years that's coalesced around taking meaningful steps to shore up the things we're sourcing from China. But for those who were working particularly in off-sector defense at the time, they now had a book. They could say, hey, this is why the supply chain of a program like the F-35 really matters, because if the Chinese are putting kill switches or equivalent type hardware hacks inside the platform, they're not going to do what we need them to do, or they're going to be extremely vulnerable like on day one of a war. And if you're on the adversary side, like, you bet you're investing a lot of energy resources in that. Why wouldn't you? And that's not even a sophisticated take, right? That's just, I think, common sense from a red team perspective. And so my hope is that in flagging some of this, that people will understand that there are very real problems, but also give them a sense of agency about it. And it's funny you mentioned Burn-In, which is a book in many ways in which the world, or particularly America, people are losing their sense of agency. And it's incredibly disempowering and frustrating and makes people really angry. And I always think about that as a writer, particularly when I write a lot of dystopian themed stories or these novels where a lot of bad stuff happens. But Ghost Fleet has a lot of agency in it, right? We see Silicon Valley entrepreneurs rising up and bashing their way into the bureaucracy to come up with a solution. We see tech billionaires and space entrepreneurs showcasing in a slightly outlandish way what is the role of the private sector in a big war. Hacking groups doing something similar. that shows a level of agency that is well outside to conventional defense organizations, bureaucracy, et cetera. And so to me, that's important. Burn-In is a really hard book at times because you're looking at this almost just like algorithmic predetermined slide into chaos. And as you said, like that feels like a lot of the environment we're living through and trying to do our best in today. And so this dyad between like agency and predetermined outcomes, as an omniscient writer, you can do whatever you want. But I always think about that reader. Like I don't want to put them in a place where they put the book down and go, oh man, we're so screwed, I give up.
Yeah.
When you talk about Americans feeling like they're losing their sense of agency, can you dig into that a little more? What does that look like right now for us?
I think it's about what it feels like, right? As much as what it looks like. Not to lean too hard on the vibes, so to speak, but the idea that we have now shifted into an information economy that is basically menu driven, right? We're receiving options that are pretty narrow in many cases, or even unitary or A-B binary. And I think that's not good for our sense of like our human experience. The way that we relate to one another, the more digital distance we're basically putting between us, even if we're physically proximate. Having worked in a newsroom where people information or message on AOL IM in the late 90s, we can lapse into these modes pretty quickly that are often not the best ways to get the most out of ourselves. And so from this question of understanding the arc of, if you want to call it progress, I think we're at a point where we are in an information economy that monetizes attention at almost like cortisol, dopamine, OODA loop. And that's happening at machine speed. That's happening in a way that is incredibly refined on a scale of refinement that is, a refinement that is far faster developing than I probably even would have anticipated. Again, having come out of the early internet publishing and journalism realm, the kind of crude systems we used in the 90s, and seeing now how we're moving at literally the speed of light, obviously. And now at that neurological level, not really understanding the potential damage we might be doing. And the notion of what is the impact in a empirical sense. You can look at mental health studies in teens. You can have anecdotal experiences and conversations with people in our communities. And the sense of agency around that is that everyone, I think, seems to feel that we may be past a point of no return because there are such calcifying shifts in patterns of behavior. And some of it's generational. There may be evolution and pushback. If you look at like a 15-year-old versus a 20-year-old and how they use social media is different. I say this in my own life and experience, my house. And I don't want to say that we're doomed. I'm an optimist who stares into the abyss is the way I try to tell people. But I do worry that people look at what's going on because they're fed such a heavy diet of cortisol and pain and puppies, so to speak, that we don't feel like we have a really clear path to do anything different, but just take what we're given at a cognitive kind of emotional level because of the way we're wed to our devices. And I'm not a Luddite, which is one of the core themes in Burn-In, but I do think that we're not responding with sophistication or intent to the moment that we're in.
Stuck on this phone tree of hell.
Have there been certain companies or even folks in that tech sector or somewhere, like bigger entrepreneurs that have gotten back to you in terms of, we hear you and we're trying to think of these private sector kind of solutions to help out with things around that?
Going back to Ghost Fleet, it actually had a really strong reception in the technology community. I believe it was Reid Hoffman of LinkedIn, among others, who were early fans of the book. And I think what it showed there foretold a little bit in the novel the closer linking of Silicon Valley to these larger national questions of defense, of public goods. And you can see that today with the flourishing startup and investment community in and around core defense tech. But at a meta level, though, I think it's really interesting to look at that question. Are senior leaders in the private sector, and we work basically exclusively with the government, so we don't engage with the private sector really very much. And I think there's room, though, for us to do that in a both advisory and foresight and futures sense, because these are conversations that are absolutely important at a board or CEO level. But I do think there still is a lot of room, though, when people to pull back a little bit and think about the larger direction, again, vis-a-vis a strategic level ambition rival like China. Am I helping or hurting the larger like nation? And is a lot of, as we were just talking about, there is a lot of technology out there, particularly in the social media domain, that is not helping that is not making us stronger. And I think having that circumspection and kind of responsibility around it, I would love to see a lot more of that. I'm very happy, though, with, again, the rise of kind of the defense technology and hardware community. I think as we move again from, obviously, software is elemental to things like small drones and these other systems, but you see a kind of much larger and growing interest in trying to make systems in the US. And maybe that foretells a shift in other systems too that are not military, but whether it's personal aircraft, the electric VTOL, eVTOL sense, next wave of driverless cars, are those going to come from companies that were founded and starting in the defense realm who said, hey, we can laterally move a lot of this technology over in this other marketplace?
It's our Jetsons future.
It could be rosy.
How does an engagement work? Like when you go to, I'm going to make things up. You go to somebody at the Pentagon or somebody in defense, working in defense, and say, let's paint a picture. And do you get them involved in crafting a fiction about the bigger picture America, and then how their unique group of people, division, what have you, participates? Do you also, if this is at all accurate, do you have them connect to it personally as if they're looking at their future selves?
So it's a really interesting process, and we've been refining it over the last 5 years, but it follows very much the steps that we began to experiment with the novels. And typically we're working with somebody who has almost like a communication challenge. Sometimes it's even linked up into like change management. We are special operations world looking at a big shift in operating paradigms in terms of the threat, the adversary, technology is moving so quickly. So what does that mean? How do you have a strategy that can address not just the force of today, but like where it's going? And so there's a spot that we can often play in helping people communicate that internally. And so the process looks, again, very similar to the fictional work that we do, where it's a ton of conversations, nonfiction research, talking to SMEs, internal and external, in our own networks, and really trying to understand what are the most important things we need to communicate. And that fundamentally, as I've seen over time, is actually a really interesting step in the whole process. In many ways, even more important than the writing itself, because we're forcing that introspection. And sometimes folks are moving so fast, they haven't had the time to really pause and pull back and say, what is the most important thing about this strategy people have to know? And we're always asking, what do you want people to do next? That action-oriented dimension to this is really important. And then from that, once Peter and I have thought that through, and if we're doing a kind of traditional story or we've done some longer projects, like say for the Army, we'll then begin to think about the creative choices, but only after we've spent a very large amount of time putting all the nonfiction pieces together. And then when you get to the creative side, there is a bit of trust that a partner has to have in us. And again, it's easier the more we do of it, but also because the books have been well received. And then to hone in a little bit on, is the path we're going one that's going to work? Is it going to be helpful? And so from our perspective, these almost like conversations bear their fruit in the form of a short story. And we do training workshops and things like that as well. So we can actually teach people how to do this. That is one of the more fun things that I think I personally get to do, to really connect people and see lights go on. When you have a conversation with someone at the end of the day, and they're like, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. And I'm like, you're a Navy SEAL. This is not the hardest thing you've ever done. But it shows, though, I think that there's such an incredible opportunity and a need, really, to be honest, to give people some new tools beyond, say, PowerPoint or others. And I would also say, too, there's just a ton of really creative and obviously talented writers throughout the national security community. And being a part of helping them actualize that is really pretty cool.
Are you hiring? I'm kidding. Only I'm not actually kidding. How do you manage the line of fiction, useful fiction versus propaganda?
That's a great question. I think because we are always looking at having a fact-based, process-driven approach to the narratives that we create, that you can tell a story that explains a strategy that's not propaganda, because you're trying to help someone make a decision themselves, not almost decide for them. And to me, being able to do that in a way that empowers someone, going back to agency, to come to that conclusion themselves is a huge part of that. And from a narrative perspective, if you are creating a story where the characters are too anodyne, or you're not talking about the bad stuff that might also happen in a given context, then it doesn't ring true. And it just does, it would seem like you're campaigning to convince someone of something that's not genuine. And so the trust that you have to build with the reader in the fiction realm is one of the highest hurdles to get over, and more so, I think, in national security. I think about this a lot just as a civilian, as an outsider. We have to do our work to really earn that trust, whether it's a 3,000 word short story or a 140,000 word novel. And being able to put that together in a credible way, I think that's what separates something that would just smack of an advertorial, if you will, that's fiction based.
I was wondering your thoughts in terms of useful fiction, if you think some of the stuff on like metrics to see if it was right or wrong, if you think that's useful or if it's not so useful with this method.
I think metrics are crucial, and they are so hard to figure out what the right ones are with work like this. And I've talked to design friends in a similar manner, people who work in the national security realm. How do you measure success? Because it might be 6 months or a year or 2 years that you have a profound impact on someone, particularly a senior leader. What I would say, though, about the measuring of like accuracy or prediction is that that's almost beside the point. And I don't want to say that we're not trying to create a faithful vision of a world of 2035 or 2040, but the point is to really get people talking about the issues and themes within. And so whether we predict the right date of a certain technological capability, does a railgun come back finally from Ghostly, or policy or doctrine shifts that are inevitable and coming, and for the Army, for example, over the next 15 years or so, we don't necessarily know where that's going to go. And we try to also protect the narrative against being outdated in a sense. And so sometimes we almost underplay certain dimensions so that it will have longer lifespan. And I think that's also really important too, because you want to be able to create, this is a question of value, right? The metric is like how much utility can someone get out of working with us and something we create. The goal is to have it be as useful as possible. And so there are certainly times when we might make more general reference to a certain military platform that we don't know if a service is going to buy it or not, or it might get canceled in 6 months. So let's not make that front and center, because the first thing a reader is going to do is say, oh, that aircraft, that got canceled. Like, the story's outdated. And so there's this, I think, kind of art to it that's a little bit subjective about trying to find that right balance. At the same time, this question of metrics, some of the ways that we think about it are sometimes really simple, like how many people did we reach in the workshop? What were their qualitative assessments? But also being able to see who reads the work that we create. A good example is we did a project for the Australian military for their defense university, which was working on a huge professional military education reform project and had a very interesting report that was 35 pages and just really focused on that kind of core PME community and really understanding what does virtual reality and other demographic shifts and all these kind of big high concept ideas mean for training soldiers in the future. And so we then created a narrative story. It was pretty long, like 7,000 words, 1.5 times or almost 2 times as long as maybe what we'd ordinarily do. And the download metrics were really important, right? I think it was like 15,000 downloads in a pretty short period of time, like a week or two. But also the number of 3 and 4 stars on the Australian side and then the US and Allied side who read it. So sometimes you're thinking about audience as a single person, and to pull back, that question of audience is like one of the most important things we have to hone in on with someone who we're working with. Who are we trying to reach? And then, of course, what do we want them to reconsider, think, do, whatever? And that, I think, is another important metric too, in trying to piece together whether something was successful or not.
It's kind of that age old, because it sounds like to me you're training for cognitive flexibility, creativity, resiliency, adaptability, and those are notoriously difficult to is there a way to measure that? Is that something that you include in those?
Yeah, I think in time, if you had like a longitudinal study, one of the programs we've been fortunate enough to work with for, I think it's 8 years now, is the Air Force Air University Blue Horizons program, and going back to mid to late 2000 teens. And when we have that continuity of working with them for that long, we actually get a lot of really good, again, as a qualitative feedback about people who have either gone on to be faculty there or have related stories of how folks have used the techniques we're teaching. In the near-term sense, for example, you might see them working on a capstone project and including narrative in it as part of their curriculum, which we can support. That's one piece of it too. But I really do think metrics are important, especially if you're doing something new, especially because the government is acquiring this, right? How do they know there's there? And I think that's an important thing for anybody that works in these aspects of the national security community that don't fit into an easy, cleanly defined box. It's hard for the government to acquire it. As you said, it's hard to measure, was this effective or not? It's not like tolerance on a machine part or something. And so I think we're constantly questing to figure out what is the best way to show that this is
it's like a lot of the kind of goodness that you get, like something from like your work and these other sort of things would be like the amount of times they think or say out loud, oh, I never thought of that before. Oh my gosh. So almost like this mitigation of strategic surprise. And that is almost hard to quantify, but that's probably one of the most important things that you can get for those work where, oh gosh, that is actually a vulnerability that we have not thought about that. Let's get to defending that.
Yeah, you nailed something. You nailed something there. When I'm often thinking, like, what's the elevator pitch for what we do? One of the easiest ways that I make sense of it to myself is using narrative to prevent strategic surprise. And that's a little bit of rip off of the DARPA motto. Yeah. But I think there's a real thread there that I think is woven through the fiction work, through the useful fiction work itself directly for DoD. Because one of the interesting things, if you look at this, is Ghost Fleet was an outside-in way that we were trying to influence. And now we're inside, right? We're working with commanders. We're working with units. And we can see both aspects. And I was having this conversation with someone the other day about what is the best way to influence the thinking, and not only that, action on preparing for the current and future conflicts that we're going to face. Is it better to be outside in or inside? And I think that's a really important thing to always be juggling and weighing. What are the best avenues? We're fortunate that we have different tools that we can use to do that, right? We could go write another novel if we wanted, or we can continue doing useful fiction work. That, to me, is a really important distinction in terms of assessing the landscape. Like, how do we have the most impact? How do we do the most good?
Do you have an answer for that? What's better, inside out or outside in?
Yes.
You'll have to share.
That's
some of the secret sauce. That's some of the herbs and spices.
Yeah, I think the answer is both. I think you really have to be able to do both. And we're fortunate that for us, it's our writing that allows us to do this, but also the nonfiction work we do. I think this is often overlooked, like how much Peter and I put into just understanding the facts and the kind of dimensions of a given issue. So whether it's the future of maritime littoral special operations or quantum computing. And the process that we devised allows us to do that work and really think deeply about it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've been able to help people as much as we have, is because we don't skip over that. There's no hand waving. And if we don't understand something, we try to figure it out as best we can. And if we don't, we can work with our partners to help figure that out, because the amount of brilliant people who are toiling away on really hard problems, there's a long list. And so just getting access to them sometimes help crack some of that.
What would you say that two questions popped in my head. One is, what do you think is the most dangerous narrative in America right now? And how do we use narrative to get ourselves? How does an everyday person use narrative to get out of strategic surprises?
I was thinking about this in a slightly different way. It's like the idea that cognitive warfare, you may not be interested in cognitive warfare, but cognitive warfare is interested in you. And I think really getting people to understand how much they are in play. And I got asked this at a security terrorism conference last year. The thing that worries me most is the weaponization of, like, my kids. And that is a really powerful way to distill. And I had a lot of people come up to me afterwards and say, I 100% agree. And that I'm talking again back to this kind of algorithmic engagement that we kind of see playing out day by day. And the actors, it's not like there's the allies and the axis or kind of a conventional framing of conflict, because it's so different. And the temporal aspect of, for our attention and time, the competition for it was both economic and strategic at the same time. It's this weird, very difficult knot that has to be appreciated for its complexity if you're going to figure out, how do we do something about that? So, like, addressing that with, say, digital media literacy, or simply better education, so people can have critical thinking skills that allow them, especially when they're younger and the prefrontal cortexes are still developing, to be able to understand that they can make decisions for themselves and don't, need to rely on platforms to basically shape their worldview, to get people to pause and think rather than respond emotionally. I feel like we may be past that line already, and that's not just looking at the youth, so to speak. I think that's a society-wide across the age gap. And that's a very lucrative position to have America in. I'm incredibly worried about that. I worry about that a lot. That's one of the really intractable problems that concerns me. And I could talk about synthetic biology or quantum computing as being disruptive, but kind of the world we're in, to your point, I think it's a really powerful narrative that we have to try to combat, that this is the only way we can be with technology.
Man, wave a magic wand.
Sorry to be a bummer, but
hold the chair.
How do you talk to people about cognitive warfare? Like, having that conversation with someone that's not focused on this, when I'm like, oh, we're at war, not just the cyber domain, but there's a contest right now that is different than any before. And people that I often will speak to aren't in the national security community. I don't live in DC. I don't really talk about this stuff that much on a daily outside of my work friends, but it's really important. And I think the narrative around that, I'd love to hear how you guys
feel like I don't know how to make it not sound horrifying. So like when they see me, it is okay. Alfred Hitchcock has walked into the room. You either like that or you're trying to find the nearest exit. It really hasn't been since, I think Jocelyn's actually been a lot more helpful in terms of taking some of the edge off. And then I think I'm just also in this really weird space. So even some of the like recent writing I had around like Chinese, we call it like Chinese video game diplomacy, but that's the aspect of, if you look at some of these like the biggest like labels out there and just like brands out there in video games, a lot of it's coming from China, and some of those kind of games for like anti-cheat, they have like kernel access to your computer, and just talking about that as a vulnerability. And some of it just comes like naturally, like you get a laugh because it seems absurd, but then I truly do believe that I wasn't worried with the TikTok when folks were worried, like, oh, it's going to go away and like people are going to riot. No, they're just going to go to like where the dancing girls are going to go to next. But for some of these video games and some of these gamers out there, if folks, be it on the China side or on the US side, were to actually do something to their video game waifus in some sort of way, on the China side, it's going to be the next Tiananmen Square, and then on the US side, it would be like the next January 6th. That's how big of an impact that stuff around gaming, again, I believe on that. And it just almost comes off as funny. Even some of the things that we talked about like initially on the show, where again, it just almost comes off as a punchline, but I absolutely believe if you're talking about top 10 information warfare forces in the world, non-state or state, if you don't have Taylor Swift fans on that list, it's not a real list. But that's just how good they are. But again, a lot of these things just come off as funny. Yep. But when you think about it more, it's actually probably even more terrifying that these things that are usually just pushed off to the side, they're actually critical in terms of like bigger national security. So I guess some of it's like hiding it and humor, but as soon as you dissect it, it's probably even a Lovecraftian kind of horror that's even maybe scarier than some of my older writing that was very just telling and not showing at all.
It's also, do we want autonomy and agency? It's like, I'm watching Pluribus, and I don't mean to spoiler alert. Oh my God, please go watch it. It's so good. Vince Gilligan, We Are Not Worthy. So good. And one of the kind of central questions early on is, do we want to be hive mind, or do we value our individuality and our autonomy and our agency? God, even the original seal of America itself, E Pluribus Unum, if I'm saying that correctly, out of many one, or sometimes translated out of one many, which I love that you can interpret it both ways. And the early premise that we are united in service of independence, and the irony of that is already hilarious to me.
So you take more humor than horror out of, I have not seen the show, but you take more humor than horror out of that?
I think fair enough. So. I think it's both. I think if we're not laughing at the horror, then we're just dying.
So August, maybe it's some of the funny at first, and then you think about more, it's terrifying. Maybe, yeah, so we just got to take the Doctor Strangelove approach instead of just maybe spooking them out the gate. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the fact that we're talking about a film project and is really important, because I think the creative realm has a lot to say and offer about how to maybe work ourselves out of this problem. And it's not just depicting kind of the ultimate division like the Alex Garland Civil War film, but rather, I think, really trying to understand at a human level, like what it is like to come out the other side. And I think that aspirational future is important. And again, I say this as someone who likes to concoct pretty dark scenarios, and working on a solo novel that deals with kind of the tactical aspects of cognitive warfare. And it's really hard to communicate that, but I feel that imperative that it's important. And Peter has, to your point earlier, has said Taylor Swift is like the Marie von Clausewitz
reference,
of social media, because his wife wrote on war, so it's an even deeper cut. But I think that's a really important thing to think, that there are actually ways to galvanize and unite people around things that are positive, if you're, without being a total Swiftie. But I think that's actually important. And the algorithmically driven division that you're seeing in our country, in our allies, not so much in our adversaries, which is interesting for a variety of reasons. And I think the commercial forces behind that too are important to understand, and are there ways to kind of change those incentives, or at least leader culture and norms, so that we're not actually allowing ourselves to lead with our chin, so to speak, so easily. But there's a lot of incentives, though, that have
so I
to get
guess some of the
realigned.
nicest. So even one of the goals for this show, in terms of showing how everyday folks probably have these different skill sets that may be underappreciated in terms of national security. The example we bring up maybe the most is our second episode. We had professional wrestler Al Snow talking about, to really understand U.S. politics, even like modern warfare, you need to understand pro wrestling. And again, funny kind of premise at the phase, but by the end of it, I think everybody got that. So if anything, I guess some of the encouragement is these folks that may feel like they have skill sets that aren't necessarily appreciated by all, and especially like in a national security sense, they should probably have some sort of seat at the table too, in terms of how do you defend against these different things. So I think that's probably one of the action item goals that we would hope to have by bringing in these eclectic bunch and talking about things around non-kinetic warfare and unconventional warfare.
I think that's a really well stated ambition, and it smacks of being successful. I've always been someone that loves like grassroots efforts and ground up movements, in part because there's an authenticity, but also personal connection. And we have platforms now like a podcast such as this, and even social media, when used well, you can create that. And through that, build a little trust. And when you have a little more trust, you start to listen a little more closely. And the hope is, I think, that you can rewire a little bit using many of these same platforms. And I don't want to say that nobody should be on social media, although I do think teens should be on it as little as possible. It blows my concentration and focus out of the water. I spent this morning trying to just stay on top of LinkedIn, and I'm like, all right, I'm going to be more proactive on social media. I lost 90 minutes. I can't afford to lose 90 minutes of my day. But that's a mindset shift on my part. And also at the same time, being able to connect with people in ways that you haven't before, or somebody new, right? Somebody who now is like, hey, I want to be part of what August is talking about. I care about this issue now too, even if it's tangential, and I'll listen the next time. To me, that's really promising.
One thing about earlier, we were talking about digital media literacy, and we talk about this, Sean and I talk about this a lot. What would you, wave a magic wand, what would it look like? What makes it attractive to people who may be like, that sounds like work, I don't want to do that?
I almost think I would actually use the way that some of the effective algorithms have been drawing people down rabbit holes. And I would almost create its own sort of structure around that, just to understand the incentives, how the social media company's business model works. What is Russian information warfare? How are they employing their tools in the US and among our allies? What does that mean for you personally? And using it as actually a true moment of education, not chastising and saying, oh, you're careless and irresponsible, don't care about yourself or your community if you're hours a day on, pick your platform. But rather to say, let's just equip you with how things actually work in the real world. Start with that nonfiction piece. It's non-judgmental. It's almost the PBS approach, the Ken Burns approach. And there have been some good documentaries. I made my kids sit through this stuff, and some books that I found personally helpful, which I haven't convinced my teenagers to read. The Chaos Machine, where you get a better understanding of kind of algorithmic shaping of cognition and attention, and how that can lead to extremism and just the things that we don't want in an open society, in a functioning democracy, in a well-prepared and well-defended one, when you have a foe like China and Russia to a smaller extent out there. And that's a bit where I would start, is with the facts, and allow people to understand that better. But I probably would do that, again, in a model that would work in a narrative sense, right? And whether it's pure fiction or whether people can see themselves in that story, because that's the other side of this. When we do these writing workshops and narrative workshops, it's easy to assume, oh, we're just going to learn how to write a short, piquant story. It's rather about communication. And in a given moment, it might be a short story. It's the best way to communicate something, or it might be literally a face-to-face conversation or addressing your unit. I think understanding, though, the fundamentals of narrative and story kind of help us be better equipped to tackle some of the really hard things to communicate. And I think we're square in the middle of one of the hardest right now.
Better memes.
Better memes is a start. I don't know how you talk about this, but if someone's like, well, what's the big deal? I think that's one of the most common responses. So what if so-and-so has my biometric data from my device, or understands when I go to bed every night, or my blood pressure or heart rate is at a given point in the day based on what I've just watched on my phone. And I think that's a really important thing to describe the value of what people are producing and who they are, because I think everyone feels commoditized in the information space we're in. So it's really easy to get that mindset. What's the big deal? I'm not worth anything to anybody. It sounds silly to talk about memes, but you are somebody. You matter. And that's actually true. Like you are the high ground that people, that the adversary and the companies for that matter are trying to seize, right? In the kind of big strategic, in the tactical sense, if not operational or strategic level.
We need a Mr. Rogers for cognitive warfare. So we've talked about
100%.
Yeah, we don't have that on the
We
list
talked
yet.
about
If Carl Sagan came back, I think that's a thinker in a mind that might be able to tackle some of this. We like
Billions and
Cosmos for
billions.
cognitive warfare.
Yeah.
Billions and billions of people out there.
There's also, this is a terrible example, but I love it so much, where you're wrapping possible. It's using fiction as a device. If you know Adult Swim,
Go on.
and they had a short. It's a horror, and I find it hilarious. And it's called Unedited Footage of a Bear.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And it's very meta, the original term meta, in how it is the worst case scenario of side effects of pharmaceuticals. And I'll just leave it at that. Have fun. Go watch it. If we have examples like that for what's the big deal, to answer your
Interesting.
question, what's the big deal? Just kind of Black Mirror-esque, but shorts, but like very short. I think that's the appetite we have to cater to.
Cocaine bearish.
Did you all see Leave the World Behind, the Netflix film in 2023?
I don't think
That's not the
so.
that's not the
Is
don't
that the
look up
cartoon?
one. Go on. I'm sorry. I don't think I have.
No, Don't Look Up is phenomenal too. I would say Leave the World Behind.
Right
It's a
there.
Netflix project.
Yeah.
That if any of your listeners or anybody needs to understand what it's like to live through a cognitive warfare attack, it does it. And Ethan Hawke, Julia Roberts. It's
So you
just
do
got a
know
great,
it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's got a great cast.
The boat.
And it's Sam Esmail, who I love Mr. Robot like massively. If I haven't gotten, I need to get I didn't want to show it to my kids because it's really powerful. But when I watched it, and my wife doesn't have a national security bone in her body, and she was like, oh, I get it. And so to me, some of these projects that are out there may be really helpful in helping people understand that. Does it really matter? Is it a big deal?
So, August, if you could finish this sentence, in 5 years, cognitive warfare will look like.
Cognitive warfare in 5 years will be even harder to detect or see. The piece of it that I think contributes to this sort of invisibility that I see is that the machine-driven, the algorithm-driven, and aspect, the hyper-personalization at scale, so that everyone's going to be fighting their own battle. And maybe that's a better way to say it, because that to me is, but you don't even know you're at war, right? That's the best, to use the Chinese 3 warfares and those kinds of reframing of what is conflict. The best way to win is to have your adversary didn't even think they were fighting at all. And that just worries me so much.
Phrase, yeah.
Already at war, getting off LinkedIn.
The war on LinkedIn. Yeah, everybody will be fighting their own battle. I actually really love that a lot. So thank you for that morsel.
Snaps.
Yeah.
August, where can people find you, assuming you want to be found?
I can be found, as we mentioned, on LinkedIn. When the Twitter algorithm abides, I'm on that a bit. You can go to augustcole.com for an overview. If you go to ghostsleepbook.com, burninbook.com, and then lastly, useful-fiction.com, the last website there is where the work that I do with Peter lives for our national security projects. And we have been able to put a lot of it in the public domain, which is awesome. And I think it's a great way to go back to show versus tell, to really see what it is that I'm talking about. There's a couple of short stories I've done on cognitive warfare for NATO Allied Command Transformation over the years. That they're harder to find. One was on the internet for a while, now it's not. So unfortunately, those are not easy to access anymore or at all.
Sir, thank you so much for coming. Again, real honor to have you. And again, I just want to thank you again in this semi-public setting for all that you can contribute, because again, it had a noticeable and felt movement to the trajectory to what I did for a career and even what I'm doing here. So thank you again for coming.
Look, I'm grateful to have the chance to talk about all this with you. And anytime you want to connect and discuss, count me in.
Thank you.
I've come to talk with you again. Come and be inside my head. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. Cancel me, cancel me. I got things to say, you can cancel me. It's only a matter of time till we all win. Cancel the mistake. It's only a matter of time. wants to say you can cancel me.